All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us here on the last panel of the day, and I think you'll agree that they saved the best for last. And so I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for taking time out of their busy days and schedules for joining us here to talk about this very important topic. I'd like to let the panelists actually introduce themselves. So could we just go down the row? And Dondi, do you want to start?
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good to see everyone here. My name is Dondi Hananto. I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia. A partner with Patamar Capital. We're venture capital investing early stage into impactful companies. So all the companies that we invest in needs to have some measurable impact, and that's what we're reporting as well. We're mainly investing in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Philippines. That's good to see you all.
Test. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacqueline. I'm from Open Space Ventures. We are a Southeast Asia-focused venture capital firm, and we mostly invest at Series A and Series B. We have done some seed rounds. We do B2B, B2C, anywhere there's an opportunity, especially if it's tech-enabled, that's where we want to be. We don't have impact themes. We're not an impact investor, but we are an ESG investor, and I'll be very happy to go more into that later.
Hello, my name is Artak Melkonyan. I'm the Senior Advisor for Equity Finance and Funds for UNDP. I am also a global lead behind UNDP Impact Venture Accelerators. Both those directions are within UNDP's Sustainable Finance Hub. So what we try to do, we try to bring the notion of impact in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, into the use by the private sector and different asset classes, including also venture capital, private equity, as well as accelerators.
Okay.
Over.
Thank you, Artak. Yeah, and myself, I'm Peter. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Synectify. We are a startup that is innovating in the renewable energy transition space. We use high-density computing power to buy surplus energy and sell time on that computing platform to basically achieve a carbon-neutral computing solution. So I'm here representing startups. I'm here to learn from our panelists. How many of you out there in the audience, if I could just have a show of hands, are from startups? Anyone? Okay, we have a few. Good. Are you anyone who is in a startup here consider themselves to be ESG impact related or any of that? Okay, fantastic. That's great. Hopefully you can learn something from our panelists as well as myself. So I guess I'd like to start out with a question about ESG, impact, sustainability, just the terminology and the conceptual space, and what our panelists think about how these terms should be defined. We, for example, are running a quiz to raffle off some carbon offsets on our computational platform, and it's a carbon literacy quiz. And one of the things I learned from the past 2 days that we've been running this is that carbon literacy for most of our respondents is actually very low. And so it seems that education on these themes is something really important. So what can you share on kind of first step differentiating the terminology?
Where do you want to start? Go ahead, Artak.
Well, I can start, and well, this is very important. Actually, what we notice is that people are using those terms, CSR, responsible business, sustainable business, impact investing, ESG, quite frequently. It is used interchangeably, which it should not, because each of those terms does mean very specific concept. Now, the way we are looking at that is that well, we start with the concept of CSR, corporate social responsibility, which is usually done by companies, ventures, investors, for the sake of looking good in front of the stakeholders, government, communities, their own employees. But usually CSR is not that much connected with the core business of the company. This is good activity, but we know that sometimes we even refer to that as CPR rather than, CSR. So the next concept is the concept of responsible business. Now, if I oversimplify it, there are a certain set of rules or values there, and there are different systems. There's UN Global Compact, there's PRI, there are a couple of others, and businesses are supposed to comply and adhere to those values or those rules. So what businesses are usually doing, they try to implement their business processes in compliance with those rules without violating those. And those rules are pretty simple. I mean, okay, don't cut trees, don't exploit kids, don't discriminate women, etc. Whereas like different sets are about different things, which is much better than CSR because it makes business a bit better. But that's it. The next concept is sustainable business. Now, under the concept of sustainable business, what we try to ask the business to be is not actually to create any harm to those other things, the environment and the people, right? Or if I try to oversimplify the concept, if you cut a tree to build your plant, make sure you go and plant 10 trees to somehow offset it, right? And within the concept of also sustainable business, we have the very sort of trendy term called ESG. It's environmental, social and governance standards. And ESG is actually a tool for risk management. It is basically looking at your activities from the risk perspective, risk of affecting social, environmental or governance issues. But what ESG does, it really looks at your efforts. Only part of environmental indicators which are under this environment the pillar, about 60% of them are looking at the outcomes. But the rest of the indicators are about your efforts rather than what you have achieved. So this is where we come to the concept of impact investing, when the major aspect here, and again, there are two interpretations of that. The general interpretation is that the distinguishing factor is that when you start measuring the result of your activities, the impact generation. So you define the impact. When you make an impact as one of the targets, now, and here is where the difference, people are saying, let's make it one of the corporate targets. Some other people are saying, no, let's make it the main target of the corporate, the impact. But once it is one of the targets, you start measuring and tracking your progress towards achieving that impact. And this is a major game changer because we have seen that the mere act of impact measurement and management is actually producing extra, and this is important, business benefits. In addition to the environmental and social aspects, if you do that properly, if you do ESG properly, because again, ESG is a must, but if you go beyond that and start doing also the impact investing, impact measurement and management, this is producing extra business benefits in form of increased profits, increased risk resilience, and again, we will be sort of speaking later on those other aspects, what are the sources of those business benefits as well. Over.
Yes, I would love to build on what Artak said and maybe just give a couple of examples on how we practice it as well. So as I said, right, we're not an impact investor, but what our approach to impact is that if a startup is talking about positive impact that it has, then we want to make sure that they're accountable for that impact and that they're actually measuring certain metrics that can prove that they're actually making the impact that they said they would. So I'll give you an example. So one of our portfolio companies in Thailand does microcredit, right? And its thesis is that it's able to lend to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to get loans from banks, people who are going to predatory money lenders because they can't prove their credit, right, in a formal sort of way. And they're saying, oh, we can go into your phones and we can basically get a sense of your credit worthiness and extend credit to you that may be a little bit higher in terms of interest rates than a bank, but definitely a lot lower than a predatory money lender. And so for us, because we don't have an impact threshold, we're not saying, oh, you need to prove that you're able to meet this and this and this milestone before we invest in you. But what we do say, to our talk's point on doing no harm, is that you have to have built in a couple of consumer protection principles into the way that you sell your product. So is it transparent? Is it fair? Are there hidden fees? Do you take into consideration data privacy, for instance? Are you, basically making sure that what you're presenting or selling is not as predatory as the people that you're trying to displace? So that would be sort of a hygiene factor for us, right? But because this company is so committed to impact, we actually work with them to report certain metrics on a quarterly basis, right? So this is where we go in and say, okay, how do we get a sense of how many people who are taking loans from you actually, maybe took a loan from a predatory money lender before. And that's something that they have to work into their system. They work into the customer survey at the point that, they're onboarding customers. They ask them, oh, have you tried to get a bank loan before? And they keep track of this. And we meet quarterly to look at these numbers and where they're headed. And so maybe that for me was kind of a way to show the difference between like a responsible investor and how much further someone who's an impact investor would take it. But I'll let Dondi speak more on this.
Yeah, thanks. I think just building on that for us, because we do have the impact mandate from day one. So what usually happen with us is really at the back of our mind, and it's kind of ingrained that this becomes the first lens that we do every time we meet a new company or a new startup. When we talk about them about the business and how it works, trying to find out about two things usually for us. One, is there any underserved or underprivileged stakeholder within the business, and how their lives get better? I mean, that's just a simple question, right? So that's usually the first lens that we do every time we speak to founders. So we have three main themes in terms of our investment themes. One is financial inclusion. So Jacqueline talked about how, for lending, for example, I think that's just very clear. The second one is on agriculture, again, because a lot of the farmers or, fishermen, they are generally underprivileged and underserved. And the third one is on SME digitization. That's what we call it. And all these are actually quite intertwined. And based on that first lens, then during our investment process, usually we work with the founders during the investment process, or after that, we start working with the founders to identify what are the metrics that they can practically measure. I think academically, there's a lot of things that you can think about, but running a startup, as most of the founders here understand, is damn tough by itself, right? You don't want the additional burden to have to do something extra to just for the sake of measurement. So we try to find something practical, something easy for them, and then build on that as the business grows. So for us, it's both the bottom line. So we look for financial returns from our investments, but also trying to start that cadence and discipline of measuring some metrics and reporting it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually, about metrics. So it raises certain questions about standardization, right, of measurements. So where are we with that?
It is a very tough question, right? I mean, in the financial world, whatever your business is, it all comes down to the same metrics, right? You look at in terms of investment, you look at the IRR, in terms of the profitability of the business, you have the same metrics, whatever the types of business are. The impact measurement world is really still new, and I would say everyone's still learning. Definitely, we are still learning as an organization. So what we subscribe to is we're a member of GIN, Global Impact Investing Network, and they have set up a catalog of measurements that people can use. So usually what we do is just look into that catalog. The catalog is called IRIS Plus. Don't ask me what it stands for. I don't remember what it is, but Google up IRIS Plus. I think you'll find it. Maybe Artak knows.
It's actually impact reporting investment standards.
There you go. Thank you, Artak.
And plus stands because it is now interpreted in the context of sustainable development goals.
Yes.
So
yeah, exactly. So that's that's what we subscribe to. So when we talk to the founders and try to find the metrics, we just look into IRIS. What kind of metrics can we use? And the nice thing about IRIS is that it's also mapped to certain SDGs. So it's makes it an easier story to tell.
Yeah, so maybe just building on that, and I'll be interested to hear what you guys think, right? When we were building out kind of approach towards impact, because I was at the UN for like a very short while, sometime in 2015, I knew there was this document, right, that basically laid out the SDGs, and it had all the targets and indicators, you will know this one, in detail. And what I realized was that when you go back to the original document that states all the SDGs, all the targets and indicators are actually very sort of almost governmental in nature. They have, percentage of the population that is this or that, number of nations that have signed on and so on. And that's why I was so grateful when IRIS Plus came out. And it had actual practical business metrics that we could use to try and interpret impact in line with the SDGs. And I've just found that so helpful because I get a lot of startups pitching us that just have a bunch of the SDG squares on their
Nice,
deck.
colorful squares.
And it's so irritating because once you go into it, they can't tell you what the metric is that they're trying to prove. And so, yes, I mean, thank you for telling us what IRIS Plus is about. Maybe you know more about the origin of that.
Yeah.
well, yeah, definitely. But one thing is, I joined UNDP also coming from private sector, shifting from dark side to the bright side. So, but with a mission of interpreting the language of bright side to the dark side and vice versa, right? So that's a couple of words about these sustainable development goals. Why they are so, high level, etc. Well, this is a global visionary targets that all the countries have agreed to have, for, now next 8 years, right? We are in 2022. Now, the nice thing about those targets is that for the first time there was a recognition. By the way, there are 17 of those targets. Each of them has 5 to 9 individual indicators within that as well. But out of those 17, 16 are targets. The last one, 17, is more like a process. It is called partnerships. But now that is very important. Why? Because that was actually the explicit recognition of the role of the private sector in achieving those goals. Right? Before, when it was Millennium Development Goals, etc., it was between the governments and people like UN, etc. Right? So now, with Sustainable Development Goals, for the first time, we said, wait, it's not possible to do that until private sector is there. That's why we put that explicit target of partnerships there. Now the question was, okay, how to do that, right? How to bring private sector to address the SDGs, and the approach here is try to implant the concept of impact into the business decision making of private sector. Now, at the time when SDGs were introduced, the industry let's a niche in the financial industry called impact investment or social entrepreneurship already exists, right? And our first strategy was try to make it bigger. But what we understood that it's super difficult to scale up a social enterprise. So, and actually pure or impact investment in its pure definition, it's not scaling the way it should scale. Yes, we have companies like Patamar there, but okay, we can create probably 5, 10, 20 of them and try to support them to scale up, but it's not what we want. We want a massive engagement, right? So I said we need to do the second strategy as well. We need to go after the mainstream players and try to make them more impact-oriented. And this is when we start working with the mainstream guys saying, why don't you invest in impact? We said, well, we need a pipeline. We need to see that investing in impact doesn't compromise our returns. And this is where we start showing that, no, this is happening. Now, coming back to your question, Peter, how to measure impact, right? There is a complex answer to that and simple. Simple one, two things. Especially for startups. We do work with startups through our accelerators, and that's actually one thing that we teach them. The simplest way, look at two things. Number of your beneficiaries, which probably could be the best proxy to that would be customer base, but not necessarily. Beneficiaries are much wider circle. Second, the value provided to those beneficiaries. So you have those two variables. You want to increase impact, increase the number of beneficiaries, or increase the value of your offerings to those beneficiaries. That's the simplest way of looking at the impact. Now, it becomes a bit more complex when you look at, let's say, I don't know, biodiversity. So who are beneficiaries, right? So those are the fishermen, or those are those animals on the coral reef, let's say, right? So that is why you need to have much complex tools. Now, IRIS is a nice catalog of indicators. There are like 600-700 of them as of now. Why so many? Because each area requires its own set of indicators. You cannot use the same indicator for, let's say, agriculture, in health care, or in education, right? But the nice thing is that it says these are like standardized indicators. You can add yours for your specific project as well. But the complexity is not in those indicators. Complexity in this concept of impact. It's very complex. I mean, in finance, it's pretty simple, right? I mean, it's profit.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
Sales minus cost, profit, maximize it. Impact is much more complex. And this is where all sort of methodologies come into play, which I would not touch now because it will take like a couple of hours of lecture. And I see Peter is nervous there already.
No, that would.
Yeah. So over to you, Peter.
I'm enthusiastic.
Yeah.
I would love to hear more about that, actually.
Yeah.
I wish we had more time. But you do raise a really interesting point about the complexity of measurement and, with impact. Although we sometimes hear in economics that economics is a zero-sum game, right? So when you try to achieve positive outcomes, there are also negativities associated with those, and that's one of the challenges that we have to take into consideration when it comes to impact as well. But in terms of the challenges to scalability, which you also mentioned, impact can be highly localized, can't it? Do you see this as kind of a general problem to scaling impact-related startups? The kind of the heterogeneity of benefits, or are there ways of overcoming that? Is this a challenge any of you have faced and have success stories in overcoming, or?
Do you want to?
I mean, just a really quick response to that is that if you're thinking of a specific business, and every business is different, right? Every business has a different model, and some of them are more local than others, right? Where you've built out salespeople that understand people on the ground, and you've built up, this massive network of, say, for one of our portfolio companies, 100,000 smallholder farmers who are now connected to market. That's not something that you can replicate tomorrow in Thailand, in Vietnam. right? But as venture capitalists, what we have is the benefit of kind of having seen that grow and scale and the types of pitfalls that might come with that sort of a model. And we can then invest in similar businesses. So they don't have to be the same business that's scaling regionally. It can be the same business model that's being replicated in different countries and creating a similar sort of impact in those countries as well.
And this is my finance brain thinking, is that what you're seeing here probably is just a subset of the investment space, right? We do equity investment, VC style equity investments, which means everything has to be scalable, because without the scalability, the investors won't be able to get the returns. I'm actually very curious, been thinking a lot about it, but haven't really found the good answer. Was as Peter mentioned, because sometimes there are some very interesting, very impactful, and can be quite profitable projects that may not be scaled, right? So it may work in a fisherman village in North Maluku, Indonesia, but that's small, right? You probably work with a couple hundred fishermen, and that works out. They may need different types of financing. It doesn't have to be equity. It could be debt. It could be whatever. So I think what I think is the challenge for the whole industry as well is finding out what are the types of financing that could be suitable, because this is not the silver bullet. We do equity because this is what we understand. This is where we know that we can get the financial returns and what types of companies, but not all companies are VC investable. So I would say, and sometimes I find this from founders where they felt like they have to fit into the financing, and that might not be the right answer.
Let me look at that through a little bit different perspective, right? So localized impact. So, well, there are both positive sides of scaling the local impact, and there are also potential problems. And problems usually come when you succeed in scaling up a local impact, which is measured very narrowly. What I mean, we are as well very irritated when we get those slides and it has, oh, my startup is addressing SDG number 1, 5, and 11, something, right? So, or I only target SDG this. Now, the problem is when we speak about impact measurement, it has to be holistic. You cannot look at one impact, okay? Because if you start doing that, that's a direction towards a problem. Now, imagine if you do it wrong and it gets scaled, you get a scaled issue. And we have those cases. UN have seen it. Microfinance, you've seen villages going bankrupt. Why? Because people are looking only on financial inclusivity without looking at financial health and financial prosperity. You give financial access, so you give a tool without teaching how to use that tool. It's like giving a gun to someone instead of doing, let's say, hunting, he goes and starts killing, the others. Such nice thing as carbon footprint, PET bottles. When we came up 30 years ago, oh, very nice, the energy consumption to produce one PET bottle is 4 or 5 times less than a glass bottle. So this is a good, carbon directing, nice solution. Let's bring VCs invest, PEs invest, build plants. Now what? PET is the major pollutant. PET bottles, right? Affordable housing projects. Very good, commendable purpose. Let's build a nice high-rise building, put people there, give them a shelter, but without looking at all the other impacts around it. Providing education, work, plan for 5, 10, 15 years ahead, look at what happened with affordable housing projects in developed countries. We call it converting a horizontal ghetto into a vertical ghetto. Right? So again, those are those very sort of striking examples, is that when you do something which seems to be impactful, when you go on to scale it, but because this sort of local impact was not properly understood, you start scaling the problems. So this is another sort of line of thought that is just to provoke some sort of thinking around it.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, and something that I wanted to build on is that when we talk about impact to the startups as well, we also look at impact risk, right? So if you're looking at, say, microcredit, we're also looking at, how long people take to pay, what the percentage of bad loans is, the understanding that people have of your product. We also ask kind of a general question around, do you feel like your livelihood or your quality of life has improved after you've taken this loan, right? So there's some subjectivity in that, but if that number goes down to like 10% or 20%, or I feel my life is worse, then there's something that you've got to really reevaluate.
So we've been touching a little bit on the issue of, you've expressed concerns about startups with an impact ESG focus that have submitted pitch decks to you. What are you looking for in impact or ESG related startup?
Yeah, I think for us, it's we don't expect the founders to have to be fully clear saying that, this is the impact that I'm going to measure. Very rarely we find someone who's got that much clarity in thinking, because again, just building the business itself is tough. So I think what we're looking for usually is the narrative and their real understanding of the beneficiaries or the stakeholders who gets impacted and how their lives change for the better, of course. And then we were happy to work with the founders to figure out what will be the best metric. So it doesn't have to be perfect from day one for us, because we know it's not easy. We're still learning after 8-9 years. So it's a whole process. So we'd like to work with the companies. But the question that we usually ask, especially when they have the nice colorful boxes of SDGs, is following up on that. Okay, you're saying SDG 1, which is no poverty. Can you elaborate on that? Who's impacted by that, and how does your product or your service change their lives to kind of get to that goal of no poverty, right? So starting with a very qualitative description, then coming up with the quantitative next. That's really how we approach it.
And do you have any advice for startups out there in the audience who are trying to position themselves for impact and ESG investment?
This is something that I learned, because again, I come from a very commercial background. I was a commercial banker, and then moving, the dark side and ruining people's lives with credit cards and all that, and then moving to the middle. I won't say I'm on the light side yet. Something that I learned a lot from friends from the nonprofit world is this concept of theory of change. I never heard of that until we started doing this. So in the corporate world, that has never been talked about, right? Whereas that's probably something that friends from the nonprofit will talk a lot all the time. That's really how that's really what opened up my mind 8-9 years ago of, okay, what's that theory of change, and just trying to think how, again, coming back to that question, how does your business change that the beneficiaries? I think that's really just a start, and then feel free to Google up theory of change and see what a lot of examples. I think there's a lot of learnings from the nonprofit side.
So for us, we actually look at businesses where if your impact scales, so too does your profits. And it seems maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but we once spoke with a company. I'm going to try and describe this without you guys being able to guess what the company is, but basically it was a platform that. Can I say this? Okay, I'm just going to say it, but I'm not going to say which country it was in. Yeah, basically, it was a platform that took basically food that restaurants couldn't sell at the end of the day, and it would allow you to buy it. And long story short, basically we said, well, shouldn't the restaurants be encouraged to reduce their waste upstream instead of kind of having this whole bunch of stuff to sell at the end of the day? And the more the restaurants reduce the waste upstream, the less volume you're going to have for your platform. And that's not something that's consistent for us in terms of scaling both profit and impact. And so we really are looking for people who kind of get both. We don't expect the technical understanding of how to measure impact and all that, because that's something that we do once we invest in you. But I think like a genuine appreciation for what's going on the ground, and also like an understanding of what impact your company is actually making in the long term, I think is quite important for us.
We have sort of our own approach of how we try to help the startups to scale up for our accelerators. And again, the accelerators are there to help them to increase their investment absorption capacity. So we think of in three dimensions, three models, right? Scaling the business model, scaling technology model, and these are primary. And when only scaling the impact model. Because without the first one, the impact will not happen, right? So while we are talking about impact, social entrepreneurship, that impact is so important, because business have to be sustainable. Without sustainable business, no impact will happen. Now, we have many cases when bringing this impact context to the startup, which never positioned itself as an impact, right? It was just a business, actually has changed their markets and contributed to sharp scaling. Only, again, no technological change, just marketing repositioning of the product from the impact perspective. Looking at the other markets where the same product, the same service could be used in a different way. And there are many such ventures. Again, I don't want to name some, but we had, let's say, a piece of equipment where the client was Deutsche Bahn in Germany, electronic equipment. So startup came to the accelerator, and when we understood that, no, actually we have much bigger market in Africa, all the remote villages would need that equipment to get, let's say, internet connectivity, right? We need a piece of equipment which was, the client was military. But when people understood what, listen, I mean, nothing, not arm, nothing, it's just, those special units which are there in jungles to use to clean water, desalinate it, etc., right? But when I said, oh, listen, but this equipment is actually needed in all sort of cases where we have crisis, where we have issue with an access to clean water, etc. And it was very cheap device, very convenient to operate, right? So, and all of a sudden, the startup gets a completely new market, both geographical and also within the segment. So, again, look at the business, make sure the business is there, and look at the impact as a chance of reformulating the markets, reformulating the benefit which is that device could be producing in some sort of other settings.
That's fantastic. There have been a few key takeaways that I think are really important and really summoning. I think, Gandhi, what you said about the humility of the investment side, and that everyone is still learning, and willingness to be open to entrepreneurs and startups that don't have everything figured out and help get them to the next level is really inspiring. And Jacqueline, your observation that as impact scales, so does the revenue of the startup is great. And I think Artak, you capped that off actually very well by emphasizing the value of both, and that it doesn't have to be one or the other. There doesn't have to be this trade-off, and that actually what we should be looking for are startups and enterprises that try to do both and do both equally well. Yeah, yeah. So I'd like to open the floor up to questions. And do we have a microphone now?
Hi, good evening, and thank you to the speakers as well as Peter for moderating. I'm Trisha, and I'm actually from an organization called Business Leaders Who Care. It's actually a club for entrepreneurs of all different types of sectors and all kinds of size, age, etc. I have a question here specifically directed to B Corp registration. It's been around for a while and it's got chapters in almost quite a number of countries, and it's something that has a presence here in Singapore but just barely got started. And I'm actually trying to work a partnership with them in order to help guide the members in the group that I actually organize to learn a lot more about how to do business in a more sustainable way. So there are certain concepts here, and I thought I'd just throw it to the panel about what your thoughts are, because it's really a struggle because of all shapes and sizes, all different industry sectors. And if you want to actually apply a matrix of measure, it's very difficult. So it's just something that I thought, looking at B Corp, having a certain checklist, is that a way to get started and to have entrepreneurs start learning and be aware of this?
We've had this discussion with one of our portfolio companies actually, and exactly what you said. Applying for a B Corp is very, very difficult, and so it has become their goal actually, that someday they will switch to a B Corp, but not something that they can practically do right now. So I'm just talking from a practical purpose. So again, we invest very, very early, seed to Series A. So these are just very new companies. It's hard, but some of our portfolio company entrepreneurs have actually mentioned that desire, which I think is nice, but it's not a must-have for their stage.
Yeah, it is pretty comprehensive. I think they have sort of a simpler version, which is a B lab assessment or something, which is not as comprehensive. But so we also spoke to one of the portfolio companies about it, and it really depends on the cost-benefit analysis for you, right? Because if you're based in Southeast Asia and it's not as recognized in Southeast Asia, then what does that certification give you in terms of, can you sell your things for more, right? So I think that discussion needs to be had. I think UNGC actually has a really good framework too.
Well, first of all, there is a confusion, even in your question, because you refer to registration, and when you start speaking about the B Corp. B Corp is not a type of a legal entity, though in the US there is another thing called benefit corporation. So that's a new type of legal entity to signify those, impact investment and right. So that's a new thing which is in addition to for-profits and non-profits. So benefit corporations are there. Now, B Corp is pure certification, and there are a bunch of those certifications. Not necessarily you need to pursue that one. You said UNGC is there, PRI is there, GRRI is there. We, UNDP, just introduced the SDG impact standards for different asset classes, for private equity, for enterprises, for bonds, and the others, right? I think what you need to understand, whether that certification is giving you what, a marketing nice label to have, or it is taking you through the process that you need to make your business better. So, for example, the approach that we are trying to propose, we are saying, listen, first you integrate the impact in your strategy. Second, you do it at the governance level. Third, you do it at the operations and management level. And only the fourth component is what we call transparency, which is reporting. So the marketing part comes last in those priorities. So that's why I think the answer to that question is what you really need, and never go for something which is really like too much of advertise, a lot of hype is around that, etc. We had very interesting research from New York University. And that was actually game-changing research, which was published about a year ago, about the performance of ESG companies, both investors and ventures, right? And it is a meta-study, which means it's not just one study. It's a study based on 900 different other studies. And we came up with conclusions. Whereas 16 of them, I will mention only 3. So first we said, listen, if you do ESG properly, you have increasing profitability. That's proven. That's not anymore anecdotal. It's not some sort of deliberation. It is there. Second, we said if you do ESG properly, it increases your risk resilience, especially during crisis times. That is also proven. And there is also another one which says if you do ESG just for the sake of reporting, when you end up nowhere. You just end up spending money on a nice glossy report, and that's it. It doesn't affect, it actually increases your costs. See, that's, again, one of those things that you need to keep in mind when you look at different sort of certifications. Most probably you don't need any.
Thanks very much for the question. Yeah, very, very much appreciated. We got kind of a late start, and we are at time, so we're going to have to wrap things up here. But I really appreciate everyone for staying back for this late session. I hope you got something out of it. I hope the startups got some takeaways. I know I certainly did. It's been wonderful having the 3 of you here as our guests at InnoFest, and thank you everyone for your insights and sharing.
Thank you.